Welcome, everyone. So excited to see some of my students from social work, poverty, and carceral systems. And my name is Tina Sachs. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Welfare. And I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Whitney Pirtle for our conversation today. The name of her talk is Theorizing and Measuring Racism as a Multifaceted, Interconnected, and Fundamental Cause of Health Inequities. And as I mentioned, I'm Tina Sachs. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Welfare and chair of the Center for Research on Social Change here at ISSI. I'd like to ask you to turn off your cell phones if you don't mind. And before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. And we can recognize that every member of the UC Berkeley community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since this institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with the university values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and our commitment to hold the university more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. I would like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Department of Sociology, Berkeley Public Health, and the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine. So what we're going to do today is after I introduce Professor Pirtle, she's going to talk about her work for about 45 minutes. Then we will have about 30 minutes for discussion. Those of you joining us via Zoom can use the Q&A feature to enter your questions, and I will ask those on your behalf. It is really my pleasure, honor, and privilege to introduce Dr. Whitney Pirtle. She is Associate Professor of Sociology and the MacArthur Foundation Chair in International Justice and Human Rights at the University of California, Merced. She is also the director of the Sociology of Health and Equity Lab. Dr. Pirtle is a sociologist with interdisciplinary and subject area expertise in race and racism, health disparities and health equity, social problems and social justice, Black feminist sociology and praxis, and mixed methodologies. She has published numerous academic articles as well as public scholarship, and she is the co-editor of the book Black Feminist Sociology, Perspectives, and Praxis. Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome Dr. Pirtle to the podium.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? All right. Yeah, I appreciate the invitation, Tina. I appreciate the labor that Max and Deborah put in. Thank you all for showing up today, and thank you those who are Zooming in. Really happy to be here and try not to be distracted by the chat already. So today I'm talking about a body of work, how I am trying to think through critical race theory as a way to intervene within health disparities research. So the outline of the talk today will be thinking of explaining sort of critical race theory, how I see CRT as a theoretical and methodological intervention, and then give a few empirical examples about how we might implement that into better measuring racism as both multifaceted and interconnected, and explaining these racialized health disparities. Then talk a little bit about how the work might grow, my own or together, and end with implications for health equity. So I am a sociologist, that's where my training is, but I call myself a critical race scholar. And because of that lens, I see myself situated at the intersection of Black studies and public health. I love folks who are interdisciplinary. If you are interdisciplinary too, you know that it brings a lot of breadth to the work that you do, but sometimes it's also bringing, like pulling sort of teeth to bring areas together. So that's what I'm trying to do in this work today and in my career more broadly. So I'm just curious to what you all think about the different areas and how they might lend oneself to one another. I do have the She Lab, and you can see, I think this is where this work sort of comes to play. The mission is to use sociological frameworks and methods to critically examine the role of race, racism, and related intersections in shaping health disparities, and work creatively and collectively towards equitable solutions that address social factors as root causes of health disparities. So within this work, some of my guiding questions are, why do racially minoritized groups suffer more from poor health? What insights can critical race theories tell us about these relationships? How can these theories refine our measurements and methods? Okay, so I don't often start from the place of asking, are there racial and ethnic differences in health disparities? That is because in almost every health outcome, we see that there are differences by race and ethnicity. That is from birth, when we look at maternal health, in some areas where Black women have over 10 times higher maternal mortality from giving birth compared to white women, all the way to mortality at end of life related to heart disease, diabetes, and more. This really came, I think, to the forefront in all of our lives during the COVID-19 pandemic. When at first, when the world sort of shut down, we thought there was a lot of, we are all in this together. And it's the equal opportunity disease. But what we found, especially in the United States and other highly racialized societies, that some groups were harder hit from COVID-19, Black, and especially indigenous populations in the United States, compared to white and other counterparts. And so again, I think this was a moment where we really had to confront what to do in a health crisis, but also how these health crises and health disparities are racialized. And it was a neat time for someone like me who is interested in studying race and racism and health disparities, where the folks that I've sort of been reading and engaging had long been saying that racism was the cause of these racialized health disparities. But it took probably until the pandemic that something like JAMA and the CDC and other sort of more medicalized and government funding agencies to actually name racism as driving the health inequities, not just race. And that is definitely where my work is situated. And I think it's really important for someone who's studying health to really get it right when we talk about race and racism. This is a study that I love to show when I'm giving talks and in classes, because I think as a society, we understand that like race is socially constructed at this point. But a lot of studies continue to show that really, like, if you get to the nitty gritty or like sample people, including medical doctors, that's studied too. So people who are in training for medical school, if they buy into beliefs that race is biological, you see that they are reporting yes. If we thought that race was a social construction, there'd be zeros in all of these cells. So for instance, do Blacks have stronger immune systems than whites? In a general population of a sample of 92, 14 people said yes. So you can see even residents, 4 of them out of 28 are still saying yes. You can imagine what that means if someone's coming with a disease like COVID-19 or another immune disease, and you think that Black people, just because they are Black, have a better immune system. That's going to implicate how they're being treated. And so we know that there's racial disparities in health. We are saying that it's probably racism, but we still sort of tend to rely on these categories of race that go undefined. And in that, we tend to think, sort of rely on old beliefs that they are biological. So that was a 2016 study. This is a 2023 study coming out in the American Journal of Epidemiology. And what they did is a systemic analysis of publications in the American Journal of Epidemiology that looked at race differences. And across all 329 studies, which included data on participants' race or ethnicity, only 4 studies defined race and ethnicity in a way that we might, as sociologists or others, find acceptable, or really teasing out what race means. And so this is another data table from this article, and you do see that there are a lot of zeros here, but actually we would want these cells to be filled. So for example, if a study has race, the number of studies, 69, from the period of 1995, and it goes all the way to 2018. Did they define it by identity? No. Self-classification, a little bit. Observed, rarely phenotype, rarely reflected, rarely ancestry. And where you see it, a lot of cells being filled, is that the definition was unclear or not stated. Again, the unintended consequence here is that if you are saying that there are racial disparities in health, but you don't define race, are you thinking that race is for some reason biological? And that's a problem. We know it's not biological. That's stemming from racialized science that was, eugenics and racist science, really. So I think there's just a conundrum with how we speak and talk about race mattering in our lives for sociological reasons, that racism is actually the driving factor, and how we're actually studying race and racism in health disparities research. Now, this is not a problem that I'm the first scholar to identify. No, not at all. Thomas Levis is a sociologist, a medical sociologist, and he did his own meta-analysis of health science research in 1994. And he found the same thing that the Martinez and colleagues study also found. And so he wrote this initial report showing the results of the study and said that people are not doing a good job defining race in their work. And what happened after that 94 study is that a bunch of scholars said, oh, we're so bad at it, we should not talk about race. And that, again, is another unintended consequence that really doesn't move us towards improvement or addressing racial health disparities. And so he wrote this piece in 1996 as a follow-up. And he says, the question is not whether we should continue to conduct research on race, racism, and health. The volume of research demonstrating race-associated differences in morbidity and mortality makes it clear that continued research is needed. It's not merely a matter of conducting more studies. What is not needed is more of the same. And so he is asking us to do a better job. This is in 1996. I think the two studies I've showed prior show that we're not really getting there yet. In his work, he was thinking through a conceptual model of race that factors in society, risk exposures, and things of that nature. You can see that, in the model, it doesn't necessarily address racism. And I think that as scholarship and society has evolved, we're better at naming racism as a problem, not just race in connection to society. So I think that is a difference from when he was writing early on. But I do think the call to do a better job is just as present today. So that is how I see critical race theory as a theoretical and also methodological invention with intervention within health research. So CRT more broadly defines a set of anti-racist tenets and models of knowledge production, strategies, and others that try to identify, understand, and undo the root causes of racial hierarchies. That I'm vaguely quoting from Chanderford and Collins, Ari Buena, in their piece. My colleague in sociology, Victor Reyes, says CRT is a body of scholarship that faces America's brutal racial history, recognizes the parts of history that remain unchanged, and works toward changing the rest. My own PhD advisor, Tony Brown, in his work on CRT and health, says CRT describes and explains the iterative ways in which race is socially constructed across micro and macro levels, and how it determines life chances, implicating the mundane and extraordinary, and the continuance of racial stratification, i.e., racism. So I think theoretically, CRT brings us a little bit closer, if we can bring it into the public health field, about highlighting the role of racism. There are a lot of definitions of racism floating around. The one I tend to emphasize is that gets a little bit more structure. This is a definition that was written in the late 1960s. So a pattern of action in which one or more of the institutions of society has the power to throw on more burdens and give less benefits to the members of one race than another on an ongoing basis. Not necessarily talking about health, but you can see how health is implicated here because you're talking about a pattern of burdens or wear and tear. And we know from health research that stress and this wear and tear gets under our body and it ages us faster and it gives us less sort of protection for health crises like the pandemic when we are confronted with it. This other quote is from Beverly Tatum, who's a social psychologist, and I really like this quote. It says, racism is like a smog in the air. Sometimes it is so thick it's visible. Other times it's less apparent, but always day in and day out, we are breathing it in. Again, not necessarily about health, but you can think about racism as a toxin in the air and how some people are more exposed to that and have less resources to buffer that than others. I think both of these quotes are related to CRT because it's telling us that racism is everywhere. Racism is ordinary. That is a key principle of CRT. So we don't necessarily have to ask the question, is racism happening? We ask, how is it happening? Because we understand that it is there and it is embedded in all of our systems. A few other quotes, thinking about racism and its direct connection to health. Rhea Boyd and colleagues in Health Affairs was writing, in short, racism kills. Whether through force, deprivation, or discrimination, is a fundamental cause of disease in the strange but familiar root of racial health inequities. This also was written in, I believe, JAMA by Flanagan and colleagues. There's a backstory here, how they came under fire and just recently had to list their whole editorial boards because they were perpetuating racism through gatekeeping and more, but they have been forced to sort of talk a little bit more about racism and say that, racism is structures, policies, and practices and norms resulting in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race, which is, again, a little messy when we're defining it. And so in this body of work, I've been thinking about, the messiness around how we're thinking about race. Is it race? Is it racism? Also, if it's racism, is racism everywhere? Is it in everything that we breathe? Is it everything to us? Is it in every institution? Does it impact our every life chance? We would say yes. And does it do it all at once? And I was like, that's interesting. And it reminds me of a recently acclaimed film, Everything Everywhere All at Once. Can I see a show of hands who's seen this? All right. So work with me. This is an analogy that I've been thinking through. I love to teach and talk through analogies. They actually make a lot of sense through the health literature, if you're familiar with Merced and the Gardener's Tale. So here's what I'm working on. So the 2022 film, Everything Everywhere All at Once, cleaned up at the award show. It was something that I had to watch, pause, and watch again because it really threw everything at you. There's a lot going on, right? And there's a motif in there about an everything bagel, which is my favorite kind of bagel. But in the film, the protagonist ends up basically getting sucked through the bagel and into a black hole where things become nothing, like a rock. Remember, there's a moment where they're a rock and everything is nothing. And I was thinking about that. If if we're trying to ring the alarm, see the rest of my notes, but ring the alarm that racism is everywhere, it's everything, it's all at once, does it become a black hole? And there was this write-up in Vulture about the film, and it says maybe some of the writers were thinking about this abstract physics concept that I don't really understand, but basically if you have something that is under enough pressure, collapse on its radius becomes a black hole. You throw everything in it, it can become nothing. And I think that we tend to see that in our scholarship as well. So we have learned to call it out in all that we see, but we have done it so much that we sort of are losing the methodological clarity that I think would help us understand why racism matters for health. So I think one way we might move past racism as an everything bagel is to return to CRT, more specifically, especially when it comes to public health. So again, this is a scholarship that has deeply informed my work, pulling from critical race theories, which is embedded in legal fields, Black studies, sociology, and creating it as a praxis within public health. So the critical race public health praxis. And it takes a set of, CRT is really a guiding set of tenets to understand things around us. So it takes some of these tenets and it puts the affiliated principles and puts it into a set of focus for scholars and researchers to shape the work that we are doing. So another figure that helps explain this, scholarship might focus on focus one, contemporary patterns of race relations, that racism is primary, it's a social construct, racism is ordinary, structural determinism says that that it determines structures and also individuals within those structures, it just becomes, it matters for all of these things. that we are dealing with. Focus 2, knowledge production, even how we're thinking about knowledge, like how is it that so many publications are out there in top journals that don't define race and racism at this point. So just thinking about our own scholarship, our critical approaches and voice. Focus 3 is where the rest of my talk will emphasize how we are thinking through conceptualization and measurement in our work. And then hopefully together, these move us to focus 4, action, which is a principle of CRT, to do better. All right, so here's more specifically what I'm thinking about. Racism is a fundamental cause of health outcomes. This aligns with CRT principles, primacy of racism, ordinariness, structural determinism. And one way we can actually think about that is understanding that racism is multifaceted, and therefore it encompasses racialization processes. It gets us beyond race as a checkbox to think about how race has come to matter and in what ways and across different groups. And I think that is aligned with race as a social construct, CRT principle, and also that racism is interconnected. It's structural and it's connected to other structural systems that bring in this idea of intersectionality as a tenet and structural determinism. And together, we can think of critical race theory, I'm arguing, as a theoretical and methodological intervention for health research. So I'm going to walk through a few examples in my work. With colleagues Ryan Cobb, Courtney Thomas, and Sandy Verity, I can say that this is a little blurry, but we analyzed the Nashville Stress and Health Study. I was a graduate student, helped collect that data. And it was looking at allostatic load or physiological dysregulation. So it's a set of sort of biomarker data that helps us think about the wear and tear. So how much load has our body carried? That goes beyond our sort of age of 37 to think about our physical age. Are we increasing rapid cell aging for particular populations just because of the stress, the pattern of burdens that are laid? And we found that skin tone is a source. So there are differences between Black and white populations when it comes to their allostatic load. But also in addition, skin tone is a source of intergroup variation and allostatic load among Blacks. And that the allostatic load disparity is smaller between white and light-skinned Black. So it tells us a little bit more, not just that there are these racial differences, but maybe trying to capture what is underneath some of those differences and maybe to look towards colorism as an additional system of stratification that can help explain how the wear and tear might manifest. So we say the results show the importance of self-identified and socially assigned race in measures. This is an article. This is like my first authored paper I published in grad school. Those are always fun and so much work to do. So this is near and dear to my heart. This is about inconsistency within expressed and observed racial identifications, implications for mental health status. So I'm going to walk through this article a little bit more to try to tease out some of these concepts. The key questions we were asking are there mental health consequences of inconsistency within expressed and observed racial identifications? And given that phenotype signals race, does skin color moderate the impact of racial inconsistency on mental health consequences? So I used the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health, or ADHOC, which is a major health-related study. It's longitudinal. I don't even know what wave they're in now. There's over 5, but it's interesting in that they have so longitudinal. They're following the same set of respondents who are younger then and now probably around my age, and they actually asked race across 2 different waves, and so that let researchers think about the potential that people might change their race over time, which it gets a little murky. But if we say that race is a social construct, that means it's informed by sociopolitical and historical changes. And you can think about how some things happen where someone might change their race. For example, the 2000 census where people could check more than one race. That is a way that some people might change their race over time, given what's happening. Other people might grow up in a white area and be white passing and check white until they realize later on that they want to identify with their like their parents' ancestry and might check, I don't know, Native or mixed race or Latinx. So there are sort of things that are happening in society and socially that can conceive of how people might actually change their race over time. And so this is a way to get at the idea of race as a process in our study that goes beyond that race is something that is a one checkbox and therefore predicts someone's health across a 30-year period. What is also interesting in Ad Health is that they have individuals self-identify, and then they also had observers identify race. And observers also identified skin color. And so if we're thinking about race as multifaceted processes of racialization, this is an interesting data set that helps tease us out because it tells us about this inconsistency and also skin color that might be getting at exposure to racial discrimination because based on how people look. Also, again, that things are changing around us and might shape how we think about ourselves racially too. So this paper in particular focused on American Indian. That was the racial label in the data set at the time. I'll use it interchangeably with Native. So I think that's the label that most people use now. And this is just a descriptive table that is showing the high percentage of sort of inconsistency. So at wave 1 versus wave 3, this is expressed, so how people are self-identifying. And you can see that 20% was consistent, but there was inconsistency across the other categories and expressed identification. And then you could see even less in terms of how people are perceiving each other. And so, oh, did I do that by touching the screen? Okay, that's back. Is it a touch screen? Okay, all right. I'll try not to touch it. But there's a lot of inconsistency within this population. So this shows up more than in my, data checks of other populations. And I think, again, that's because of different socio-political things that are happening. There's like indigenous revitalization in the United States and globally. Also, a lot of myths about who is indigenous, and people are getting called out by that. So you can see that this is an interesting population to study these things. I'm not going to say that might look the same for every population, but for the questions that I had, this was an interesting case study. Essentially, the findings showed that inconsistency among observers' identification was linked or significantly associated with poor mental health outcomes. And then the interaction with skin color, so you can see that those are inconsistent, had a higher odds. This is for suicidal ideation, one of the measures I used. And the gap shows up mostly at lighter ends of the skin color. So this makes us think probably people who are more racially ambiguous because it's based on observer race, that might be heightening some of the stress that they're feeling and causing one factor that might cause increased suicidal ideation. Obviously, there are more, but just in teasing out, again, race and racialization processes, that is what we found in that piece. And we argued that observed inconsistency might act as a marker for stressful experiences associated being not readily classifiable in a world that is really obsessed with tidy racial classifications. Okay, I didn't start the clock here, and I don't know what time I started. Do you all know? Okay. I'm going to move more quickly through this example, but I have focused a lot on race and racism. I'll get to the racism part soon. But I think that CRT also can teach us a lot about ethnicity. And sometimes it's not a key part of the conversation, and I would argue that it should be. So with folks in my SHE lab, we published a paper called Conceptualizing Ethnicity. And we were asking about how different dimensions of ethnicity might shape intragroup variation in their health outcomes. And yeah, does it contribute to the disparities? And so this is by Ford and Herrera, and they put out a theoretical piece. I showed the conceptual model from this piece, but they were trying to, this is our table, but adapted or informed by Ford and Herrera. And they were saying that sort of pushing scholars to think about CRT and ethnicity, because sometimes what happens is people try to skirt around race by using ethnicity. But ethnicity is highly racialized in the United States. And so there's a lot to say, even about race, if we're talking about ethnicity. And so we think that CRT really needs to be a part of that conversation. And one way we might tease out the differences is thinking about these sort of attributional dimensions of ethnicity, which is maybe how folks usually are thinking through ethnicity, or yeah, like nativity, language, and sort of related to sociocultural characteristics. But there's also the relational aspect too, that emphasizes positioning with the US hierarchy and associated with phenotype characteristics. And so what we did is use this theory and tried to apply them to adapted measures. So again, using theory to inform measurements that might tease out the multifaceted nature of race and ethnicity for health disparities. Now, for this question that we had, it made sense to look at the Latinx population because there's a lot of ethnicity research happening in that group. Every racial group has multiple ethnicities. Is there work on Black ethnicities? No, and I think that's a problem. Rooted in anti-Blackness, there should be more of that. But this population has a lot on ethnicity, and so that's sort of the population that we're interested in. And we use the Portraits of American Life study, and simply because the types of dimensions were available and showed up in the data. So that's a key part of doing work that's theoretically informed, is finding good data, and eventually producing good data is important too. I'm going to skip through and just show this figure. We basically created ideal types across different attributional and dimensional measures, and we did find that there are differences. This is good health, so self-rated health. So are people reporting good health or not? We also had feelings of worthlessness for an outcome. And the major takeaway here is that there are a lot of differences. Actually, I'm going to go back to the table. In terms of skin color, racial misclassification, you see significance showing out in terms of how people are thinking, how important their racial and ethnic salience is to them. Also the choice, the racial choice, because you can check ethnicity and then you check race, if they're checking white versus other. There are differences that show up within this population if you tease out the sort of ethnicity as a check-all. And if we focus on ethnicity as a check-all, we're missing different experiences that the Latinx population has that we would argue are highly racialized, actually. So we say that attributional and relational dimensions of ethnicity condition health differently, highlighting the nuances that are not often reflected in the broader definition of ethnicity. So another example of, I think, how using CRT to draw as an intervention to help build out our measurements and conceptualizations, operationalizations is really important to better understanding health disparities and to do a better job. But the emphasis also should be on racism too. And another, some of the driving tenets are that racism is ordinary, but also another tenet in CRT is intersectionality, that we need to look at intersections. So I have done this, I've theorized about this in a few different ways. There is this piece on racial capitalism, again, coming from Black studies, but how it might be a theoretical apparatus to help us think about what makes something a fundamental cause. So I wrote this piece early in the pandemic, and shortly thereafter, I collaborated with a public health grad student and wrote about structural gendered racism, theorizing how the intersections across structural systems might disadvantage people during the pandemic to have good health. So we theorized how structural racism and structural sexism are interconnected and work together to disempower, especially women of color, across various domains. So thinking about the shelter at home law or policies that came out, really didn't think about women and what that might mean for them. That we saw an increase in intimate partner violence, a closure of social support systems, shelters were shut down, and a higher rate of women of color specifically being evicted during the pandemic. And in the article, we emphasized Kimberly Crenshaw and her theorizing about intersectionality. And in her section on structural intersectionality and mapping the margins, she talks about how the laws that we create really don't think about women of color in particular and how they're like entering multiple domains of disempowerment. So she talks about Latino women who couldn't get divorced because of deportation laws or marriage clauses that say you have to be married a certain amount of years to maintain citizenship. And so their choice was between staying in a domestically violent relationship or deportation, and that level of disempowerment. And we saw some of those same things show up in the pandemic. Also, in terms of jobs, women of color were more likely to be in frontline, low-wage, precarious work. Not the surgeons, but the home health aides, for example. I think the stat here, I don't have it in my notes, I don't think, but in terms of Filipino women, it's like they make up maybe 4% of the nursing population broadly, but 20% of the deaths of COVID-19. And so, yes, home, jobs, and then also in terms of the healthcare interactions, that there's gendered and racial bias, and Black women in particular have been reported over and over again not to be experts of their own body. And that's one of the rationales for like maternal health mortality rates. So that was our theorizing, that there are structural systems. Racism is connected here in particular with structural sexism and gendered stratification to disadvantage women of color. In a recent publication that's out in JHSC with Conrad Franco, Caitlin Patler, who also is now at UC Berkeley in maybe public policy, I'm not sure what department, we were trying to really use that theory and understand the wear and tear for women of color during the pandemic. So we asked, how has the COVID-19 pandemic been associated with changes to daily activity limitations due to poor physical or mental health? Are they stratified by race and gender? And are they patterned by structural inequalities such as structural sexism and racism? To do this work, especially answer the last question, we are joined, or we are influenced and informed by a set of scholarship that is pushing us to think about racism as structural and in our models. So we say it's race, not racism, that is helping explain these health disparities, but how are we measuring racism in the work that we do? And so that is where I think the field is really headed. So this by Patricia Homan, Tyson Brown, and Brittany King. There's a lot of other studies here if you look at the literature, but this is one study that they introduced to try to look at, they said structural intersectionality, but thinking that if we say structural racism, for example, is in the judicial system, how can we get at that? If we say it's economic, if we say it's related to segregation, can we create a dissimilarity index and then put that in the model to try to tease out structural racism? And then also the same structural sexism. For instance, we know that it's political. So what about the percentage of state legislator seats occupied by men in a place? So it's state level structural factors that they're encouraging us to account for if we're trying to actually tease out how racism matters. This is again from their work. So you could think about someone in Mississippi that has relatively high level exposures to structural racism, sexism, and income inequality. A woman of color there might experience her life and her health differently than a woman of color in California that has lower exposure at the structural level, for example, across all three of those. It's just an example. And so what we did is apply those same indices into our analyses of the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. And we were interested in daily activity limitations, again, just to get at the things that we're theorizing, that women are disempowered in all these different domains. What does that look like for their health overall? And one way to study that, interestingly, we think is like asking the question, how many days did poor or physical mental health keep you from doing your usual activities? Just those days where you struggle to get out of bed, the wear and tear. And we compared May to December of 2019, so pre-pandemic, to May to December 2020, the early pandemic period, and wanted to see if there are differences across race and gender. This is a table from the female subsample, and activity limitations days is at the top, and then it's just a dichotomized variable in the second row. And so we're comparing again, white, Black, and Latino, Latina, Hispanic, Latinx. pre-pandemic to the early pandemic. This figure, I think, explains it even better. What we found is that the pre-pandemic in the like pale bars here, that white men, Black men, and Latino men reported actually fewer days of limitations during the early pandemic period, as did white women. But it was Black and Latina women that actually reported increased activity limitations. They were shouldering the burdens, we would argue, across those domains that I explained. And this was one way we could really tease that out. And it was replicated across our indicators of activity limitations. And then when we controlled for the state level controls, we found that like it just only exacerbated what we found. So in the states where they were high exposure to structural sexism, racism, income inequality, especially for Latino women, their number of days were increased. And so we were just doing like population predictions here. The pandemic may have been associated with approximately 3.53 million additional days of health-related activity limitations for Black women and 13 million for Latinas. In contrast, white women actually experienced fewer days. And so we argued that considering structural inequalities at the state level helps understand exposure to unequal systems that harm marginalized racial and ethnic groups, but also how structural protections and greater access to flexible resources available to those who are racialized as white protect health here. So thinking through structural systems is really important. Again, I think that is where the field is headed. There was a special issue in health affairs, and folks are doing it in really interesting ways, you know, creating an index of structural racism, but also if we say that it's in our structures, what if we look at who's hired at hospitals since they're making decisions, or in an algorithm that would tell you what treatment to give a person. Those are ideas for thinking beyond race and towards racism when we're looking through racial health disparities. An earlier collaboration with Caitlin Tatler that I did sort of used another social experiment to figure out how laws might matter. And so here, her work has been primarily on immigrant populations and the ability to obtain DACA. And so we were able to compare individuals before they obtained DACA to when they got it and self-reported health. And found very significant associations between getting DACA and having better mental health. The only thing that it didn't protect in terms of their health was their worry about family, because a lot of folks, you had to hit a certain qualifications to get DACA. So moving forward, I'm just want to encourage anyone who's interested in this sort of work to do the work, to think about theories and what we know from interdisciplinary spaces like Black studies and sociology, that if we're thinking about health of Black Americans, what are the racial ideologies that are really putting folks at risk for harm? And what are the particular racialization processes that we might tease out? And what are the specific racial structures, again, that would help us figure out why, what is going on, and to do what Thomas Levis asked us so long ago to do a better job. And that these things might not be consistent across racial groups. And that is also another limitation that I see. We say structural racism is one thing, it's racial segregation. That impacts groups differently. If you're on a reservation, that's a different sort of experience of segregation. That different laws have been passed that target Latinx Americans in terms of, do you look quote unquote illegal? And we see these laws popping up again today, which is crazy. Interactions with ICE versus compared to interactions with the Indian Health Service. Like there is so many opportunities to use theory, critical race theories, to embed them within the health literature that I think can refine our analyses, tease out what's really happening, and do a better job, and then hopefully address it, right? So this can be expanded, it can go, and it can go, and it can go. We can think about Asian Americans too, also white Americans. There's a lot of interesting work like Jonathan Merced's work about how racism is killing white people too. Or even disentangling whiteness. We have a lot of movement on the MENA category and what that means. And then also what's added here is racialized buffers. What are those things that protect people, protect health, that are more stemming from racism as multifaceted and structural too? And the last sort of piece of reminder for CRT is from Ryan Petaway, who graduated from UC Berkeley, I believe, and he posted this poem, he published this poem in that Health Affairs special issue. It's called Cock Prune Roses. If anyone has used any statistical programming, this might sound familiar. I'll read just the first stanzas. To live and die in a confidence interval is nothing like LA or any place I've ever known. Run, semicolon, error 76-332, syntax error, statement will be ignored. And one of the key tenets of CRT is to always emphasize voice. And so even though I'm showing you quantitative work that's asking us to do deep theories and build it into our methodologies, and that is a lot of the stuff that gets published in health work, but there are, I think, ways that we might emphasize voice in really provocative and powerful ways that should not be lost if we're trying to bring CRT into the health literature. I will end there, but if you all want to talk about implications in Q&A, I have some slides. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Miriam. That was a really great talk. Thank you so much for your insights. I was wondering, beyond theory and kind of once, theory is being implemented and, kind of going beyond academia, do you think that these critical discussions and conversations should be implemented at a policy level? Do you think there's a way that providers and researchers at the individual level and within their kind of community circles, even like labs or institutions, can begin to kind of work through this? Where do you see the theory going if we're not considering like policy implementation?
Right. That's a great question. Thank you, Miriam. I think it has such like ripe opportunity to impact spaces beyond academia. I think a lot of the work that I've been doing is for scholars, but it can matter in really big and small ways. For example, a group of legislators had to get together to push health departments to release data on race during the pandemic because they weren't capturing it. And so we didn't know how bad things were. In addition, health departments didn't have the same measures for capturing race or ethnicity. So making comparisons was really difficult. And if you can't find clarity in the question you're asking, you can't really find clarity in the answers either. And so I think it's really important in terms of people who are going out to be public health practitioners to think about these questions. And something easy is to be like, okay, you said race matters, how are we measuring it? But that sort of thing can shift conversations. When I was publishing the second piece on structural racism and gender, I was trying to find, that came later. So there was data coming out and I was looking at health departments data and I was trying to look at within Black populations, what is the gendered breakdown? And there was no accessibility for like variation across status. So again, another way to be like, wait, can we show this data? Can we capture this data? What questions are we surveying? So it can matter in that space. It matters a ton in terms of healthcare interactions as well. One of my favorite podcasts is Code Switch, and there was a recent episode on this. So I'm just I don't remember the researcher's name, but it was really good overview. Dorothy Roberts' work has been exceptional here, and others, in that the policies we make in terms of identifying health problems are often racialized and based in pseudoscience. None of it mattered. But for example, the idea that Black people have bigger lung capacity. So when they're testing for things like asthma, there was in the algorithms, it might say, if you check Black, this person needs to meet this criteria. And the checking of Black is usually based on an observer, which we get wrong, and changes over time. In addition, doesn't make sense for people like Dorothy Roberts, when her TED Talk is really good on this and it's on YouTube. She's mixed race, and so she's like, what race are you assigning me even? If it's based on ancestry and you're going to give me my mom's race, I'm going to show up as white, even though that's not my experience. And there's a lot of misdiagnoses that happen too. Even thinking with like sickle cell anemia, that shows up more in Black populations. But if you don't test everybody, you might miss it in a non-Black person. And so I think in terms of doing better when it comes to race and ethnicity, there's a lot of space for that outside of academia too. And I think it matters for racism and just like calling it out, because within places not like this, again, if the takeaway, if you're saying Black people get diabetes more, Black people get heart disease more, Black people get this and that, the idea is that, is it something wrong with Black people's bodies? Or even if you go beyond biological, is it something wrong with what Black people are doing? Like their eating behaviors. So it's very individualized and doesn't actually point to racism as a structural system. But I think this stuff matters in all different places. Again, in these like really small ways, just talking to people, if there's like make a comment about somebody and they're like, I don't know, health behaviors, but it matters in big ways in terms of policies and how we're measuring disease that can be life-saving.
There are a couple questions from the chat, unless was there a hand here in the audience? Any other, from Brianna Johnson, any other implications you want to talk about? Because you mentioned that you had other things.
Yeah, can I show? I know we just turned it off, but sure.
Share your screen again.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just gonna wait till it turns on.
So the implications that I was going to show, there was the piece in the American Journal of Epidemiology that I mentioned, and they invited a set of commentaries to follow up with that. And so with Chandra Ford, we should have a forthcoming commentary that sets forth a few implications. And they are focused a lot on, again, scholars, researchers, and that nature. So what we can do better across all of the focus of CRT and public health praxis. So even knowledge production. So JAMA, I said, they just had to identify all of the editors, the race and ethnicity of all the editors. And so that's interesting if you realize there are only white male editors. And what does that mean if someone's trying to push the field forward and say, let's focus on Black women? Is it more likely not to get good reviews? We don't know, but pushing knowledge production, there's like, that's one intervention. Maybe a guideline for if it's going to be published, you have to have a definition of race. That's one that can happen. In the piece, there was actually no mention of racism either. So the framing was, how are people talking about race and racism? But my thing is like, well, they should also identify racism here, because that's what's going on. That's a thing behind the surface. Yeah, so I mean, our basic, we identified multiple problems in the field, and then these are what we think would address some of those problems. So engage and apply critical race theory and other theories. Oh, okay. Yes. Let me find where Zoom is. Okay, sorry, y'all.
Yeah, looks great.
Okay. To increase and apply rigor regarding the measurement of race and ethnicity, again, like having a set of guidelines. But it's so interesting in this field, especially if you're doing quantitative work. The idea is that like, oh, we're like very objective, and we really love rigor, and pushing rigor. Like there's a set of standards for how many cases you can publish, but like, how come we don't have that rigor when it comes to race empathy? So just defining that as rigorous, I think, is important. To name white supremacy and the ordinariness of racism in our discipline. And yeah, to bring clarity in the empirical and applied work, just like Miriam was asking. And I don't, in the forthcoming piece, we talk about all these things a little bit more, but we do have this, some of the recommendations that folks might bring into the work. Let's see, recognize the limits of one's own expertise and epidemiological expertise. collaborate with others who hold expertise in conceptualizing, operationalizing, and analyzing race identity. To compare and contrast methods with prior studies, critique as racist. Yeah, there's a few different things. We didn't actually talk about it in this piece, but as you all saw, a lot of my work on health doesn't necessarily rely on validated health measures. And I actually find a lot of benefit in that. Is it hard to publish that? Yes. But the standardized measures are usually then validated or reliable based on white populations, number one, and don't account for the racialization processes. So like the using feeling worthless as a health outcome got some pushback, but the other ideas are like, are you depressed? Some groups, like you say you're depressed in a household, your mom gets mad at you. So what other health measurements really might attach to like what we understand about race and socialization? I think that's a big intervention too. So I don't know if that's what Brianna, I think in the card asked.
Yes.
Okay.
Other questions in the room? And then I have some great questions here too.
Yeah, this is an amazing panel. I'm so glad I came. Yeah, I'm fond and a fan of your work on Black and Sociology, and it's cool to see this area of your research. I also think it's very clear how it's multifaceted and interconnected. So it's just a great presentation. I feel like you answered some of the questions that I had during the presentation and gave me a really great overview of the literature and how you're intervening and offering methodological and theoretical clarity. So I guess I'm just interested in like, given how much critical quantitative work you've done trying to make use of survey data that has certain limitations, and you're like doing amazing work with it. If you got to design a survey, like what are some of the measurement pieces that you want in there for the kind of work that you want us to be able to see?
Yeah, this is a great question. I love this question. Part of the reason why it was definitely one of my qualifying exam questions. So something that I should have been thinking about for the last 10 years. Yes.
Or some of your favorite, or from some of your favorite items on surveys, even if it's not. Yeah.
One thing that I didn't highlight so much, so I'll bring it up now, is the fact that I think that racial identity is different than racial identification. And that's stemming from social psychological work. And so, for example, Blackness is not a monolith. Some people love their Blackness. Some people are dealing with internalized racism. And so to say like Black identity might like that thinking through Black identity salience, so how much you like your Blackness, would show variation within the Black category, and maybe why some people can buffer in the experience of racial discrimination versus not. So these identity measures, so salience is one, centrality is another. There's like things like how you public regard, private regard. So in the psych literature, there's some really great stuff on identity, and I would love to see those items and that could tease out skin color for sure, because I really do think it gets at the observed nature of race in a way that self-identification cannot. Nancy Lopez, another one who's highly influenced my work, has been trying to, even in the census, get her concept of street race published. So just to make it, like if I say, what's your observed race, maybe that doesn't make sense. But if you ask somebody, you're walking down the street, what do people think you are? They're like, oh yeah, I'm misread in this way and that way. So that can capture it. I think that's a really neat one. In my conceptual model, there was a lot of arrows, and the arrows are really undefined here. A lot of the health literature does focus on racial discrimination and racialized stress as some of those, like sort of the mechanisms that shape race to health. I just couldn't put that in here. But I think that's a key part too, like trying to get at racialized discriminatory experiences or microaggressions, racialized stress. What's super interesting in some studies relatively recently, so a lot of times discrimination is like, have you been followed around in a store, for example? That's like a day-to-day harassment. Or have you been fired from a job? And then you ask how you attribute that experience to what thing. Recent research has found that white Americans report even more racial discrimination in groups of color, right? Like, and so it's like, oh, so you even that you can't just throw it in the model and say it's doing what you think it's doing. And so like even teasing out those mechanisms more, I think is interesting, and maybe not separating the attribution. I get the attribution matters because it's like, you might be followed because of your race, but also your perceived class. Like there's all these different things that happen, but we have to find a way to tease out like what's going on there. And then again, like my advisor Tony Brown in the National Stress and Health Study, what was the major contribution there was thinking about racial trauma as a measurement. So not just stress, but racial traumas. There's been really important work about witnessing police violence, which we're all exposed to, right? Like George Floyd, we all witness that, but some people have closer experiences to that, or we witness it in social media, or we're on the front line. So like, how do we get at, and we know like that hurt so many people, right? It hurt all of us, should have hurt all of us. So how can we tease, like, how can we capture that too? So a lot of cool things on race, the mechanisms, and the health outcomes. I think that like it matters for all of those things.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes. Yes, please.
Not the question I was previously thinking about, but a lot of what you're talking about here is really, because our work is really very closely aligned. Something I've been thinking about lately, I'm just wondering your perspective on, is like Eve talks about sort of a politic of refusal, and a way of saying that in certain ways, like knowing, like we keep showing them, and it's not enough. We keep making better measures, we keep iterating, we keep going around, and that there are certain things that certain groups of people should not be allowed to know. Meaning like there's certain in-group experiences that some people, like, you just don't get to know, and the academy does not deserve to know certain things. And I'm just wondering if just your reaction to that, or I know it's a very philosophical question in certain ways, but as a person who is, at least I'll speak for myself, ostensibly both affected by and sort of living the, my Black racial ambiguity and lighter skin and all of the things, right? Just wondering if you have any thoughts about sort of how many times do we need to show them? Yeah. Because we know what's going on here a lot of times. I don't know. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I have a great answer to it, but I think I said I don't ask, are there racial disparities? And there's so much work that does. It's like, is there a disparity in this? And that just, it is.
Yeah, we know. Yeah.
But even at this point, sometimes asking like why is sort of just like, we also know that too. And so I can find myself struggling in my own work that I do. But I do think, CRT will say it's not about if or why, but it's how it's showing up. And so I do think that's an important area of study. But that I agree with you that sometimes that how might matter for particular communities in different ways. I mean, community-based research like does that as well, I think, but it's still in a way that can be extractive often because like, the currency that we get, like we talked about last night. Let me think. There's a piece that I really liked recently, and I was just a reviewer on it. So it's not my area, but and like the Ubuntu public health group, but they were doing. They called themselves like, I think something about the Ubuntu praxis and basically doing healing circles with Black women after they were testing, like they were trying to test out a psychological, like superwoman schema. So they were like, we don't want to do a focus group because we're coming in, we're getting there, like we're gonna actually do a focus group, but like almost a healing circle. So we're gonna ask them the questions, and then we're gonna use what we know to right now share strategies or build a collective community for these folks. And so that approach is like, given what we know about how Black women show up and do a lot, how can we show up for them? But I think it takes a Black woman scholar to be in the room to create that and build those narratives. So it's like there's space to do it well sometimes if you have the resources and time, and space that gets constrictive. And refusing is great. It is great, but there are consequences.
Right. No,
So
right.
I think it depends in like knowing what the consequences are and if you want to take them. So I don't know.
Yeah, no,
I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know that I answered your question. One thing that I will say, like a small refusal that I have done is I don't often say that I study racial disparities or even health disparities. And that's what I was. It had health disparities as my area in my CV. Now I'm like health equity because I'm trying to push myself to do that. Like, what does this mean for equity? So,
no, very similar. Yeah, and there was no right answer. I just was curious about your feelings about it, really, because it's sort of a tough place to be in some respects. So.
Definitely.
Yeah. Is there a question?
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask a question about, it seems like in your analyses, you've taken these large data sets and essentially focused in on, one particular race or one particular, like Latinx, and so I guess my question is, you also towards the end show like there's commonalities, but there's also unique experiences that need to be captured. But in public health, a lot of times, we'll adjust or do something in that regard. So what's your take on that? Should we be doing within race like analyses, or should we be adjusting? Or not even adjusting at all?
I mean, I think I appreciate coming to health through sociology because I think it did allow me to think a lot about research questions. So if I'm in public health spaces, sometimes people will ask me, what population do you study? And I'm like, all, or like, what health outcome do you study? Whatever I have access to. And I know that's coming from my training. And I know I'm also not an expertise in every subpopulation and their racial experiences. So that's a limitation that I have. But what I appreciate is that I think using theory means that I'm asking a question, and the question is going to drive the population and the health outcome. And so it's really like the value of inquiry there. And that together, I think this is putting, the puzzle pieces. So one paper alone is just like a piece of the puzzle, but it feels fun to try to get at that puzzle. So that's how I approach it. And I know that sometimes it's hard if you are like a public health grad student and you're told to do this one thing. That doesn't mean that there's limitations. Like I think if you have insider knowledge that is not, I don't call it me search. I'm like, it's your standpoint that really gives you a lot to say in these spaces that should be valuable and not devalued in some cases. Me search is the idea that like if someone's studying their own population, you're trying to study yourself. But it only really gets applied to people of color. And there's a lot of white research. But it doesn't get called research, and then it applies to everybody, and it doesn't make sense. So I'm just like, I think, if you have this insider knowledge, that's valuable. And it should drive the work that you do. I approach it a little bit differently, and I think in order to do that as well as I can, I have to be tight with the theory.
Hi, my name is Anna Maria, and I guess I'm just curious to know more about like how you navigate doing research within the Latinx population, because when I think about it, there are white, Black, and Indigenous Latinx, and I feel like very often they're separated. So I'm just curious to know how you navigate.
I think the one paper is probably the best experience. The paper on DACA, I think at the end of the day, it was mostly Mexican Americans who were the participants because it was pulled out of recruitment. to get information about DACA in like LA. So that was the main population that study focused on. The other data, I think, was an example of how we tried to tease that out a bit, and it's still incomplete in a lot of ways. So every 10 years at the census is a big debate on, is Latinx a race or ethnicity? And there are a lot of arguments for that. Among Nancy Lopez, I said her name earlier, is a Dominican woman, and she really wants there to be separation between ethnicity and race, for example, because she said if it becomes a race, you're oftentimes erasing Afro-Latinx or Indigenous Latinx identities, because it's not necessarily mixed race. It is that they are Black and have this ethnicity. And so even though a lot of the population is arguing that it should be, because it's so highly racialized, it should be a racial category, but doing that can also create erasure, like you're identifying. And so I think, that's not my own group, so I'm like deferring to people who have made these arguments because I'm coming in as an outsider. But I do think to Caleb's question, if I was doing my own study, I would want to ask this thing. Of all groups, what is your ethnicity? Self-identified. What is your race? Self-identified. And then what can we do with the data? Now, I will say on the receiving end, if you ask open-ended race questions, your answers are all over the place. Like, and then I'm the one at the back end reducing their heterogeneity, because I'm like, I only get to put so many people in a regression. So it's problematic, but I do think that there's a benefit for asking about ethnicity. But I do think we could do it better too.
We have some great questions from the chat. From David Gonzalez, thank you so much for your talk. Can you share more about praxis and how that fits into your academic work?
Yeah. So praxis, an easy way to think about it is the practices you're doing. And so I think CRT tries to encourage a praxis to be anti-racist in all that we do. I always think that I could do more. Personally, I always think that I can do more when it comes to praxis, because our jobs are so defined in particular ways and how we're evaluated. But I think praxis might show up in different ways in teaching, thinking about who I'm assigning, what I'm assigning. Is it podcasts? And like having students. I'm at Merced, which has like 60% Latinx students. So my students are often saying, oh, here's our experiences, and I can pull that in. And I often assign assignments where they are teaching, because I want them to experience being an expert. And so like those are small things that I practice that I might build in teaching. In terms of researching, I don't have any copies here. The racial capitalism piece I published got a lot of engagement. And so it was important for me to try to make that accessible, because people were dying, and it's like I actually have expertise that people are caring about for once. So like agreeing to be on public radio or speaking to 7th graders about racial capitalism, that was hard, but I did it. So just like showing up when people ask is a part of my practice. I created a comic that's open access to try to illustrate that, to make it more accessible. That's another part of praxis, I think. Creating a lab space like the She Lab is a part of like my mentoring praxis, just to demystify what's happening, how these things get published, or the conversations that we're having. I think that there's a lot of other opportunities to do praxis by being engaged in the community. So I haven't done so much of that health related. I live in a small community, so it's easy to show up. So yeah, I've hosted a DA forum because those are related to my politics and who's being the DA, or like marches and things. So I do those sort of things that are just because of the praxis that I have as being anti-racist and how it shows up in different areas. But if you're interested in health, I think there's a lot of places to like intervene, talk to the health clinics or doctors, health departments, do all of that sort of stuff. So thanks, Daniel. I don't know. What's Daniel?
Thank you. David.
David, sorry.
Okay.
Kind of vague question on, I was thinking about the study that you mentioned that was about, that talked about like using both a self-identified racial identity and also having an observer identify someone's race. And I'm wondering about if there's any other literature, if you have any other thoughts on like how dissonance between like these different measures of race can appear or affect self.
Yeah. In that paper, I did get into like the social psych literature even more and about like identity feedback loops as explaining the process. And so, because it's like, why would changing over time, like, what does that even mean for mental health? Is a question. It's like there's a body of literature on identity stress beyond racial identity, just like how identities can be stressful. That was one of my first publications, so I'm a little bit removed from, I don't remember everything. Peter Burke, I know I highly cited him on identity loops and stress, so that's one thing I remember. But when it shows up for race, there's been interesting conversations. I think that, the debate between, is it the interviewer that should capture race or the self-identification? I appreciate studies that have both of those things. I'm trying to think of other examples of literature, but I don't know if I'm thinking about it on top of my head, so you can email me.
Yeah, we're at time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So sorry. Okay.
Sorry to folks in the chat.
There's so many good questions here. Thank you so much for everyone who came in person, everyone who attended online, and let's give it up for Dr. Pirtle.